Well, welcome everybody. So today we're talking about Hugh of St. Victor, and Alex, you were saying that you had somebody that has been writing about this. So if you have things that you've learned about him that you want to throw in there, by all means, feel free to share your knowledge. Yeah, so this month we've been reading Hugh of St. Victor, and according to Richard Gamble, there's not a ton known about him. We know that he was educated at a monastic school in Saxony, and in terms of his role in life, he spent the rest of his life at the monastery, known as a theologian, a philosopher, an educator, and he is probably most well known for what we're going to be reading today, the Skilion. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, please correct me. But before I actually hadn't read him specifically before we assigned it for this month's reading, but I had heard plenty about him from other classical educators. And usually when I heard them talk about what he lays out for us about the liberal arts. So that's what I was really excited about. Just hearing from the horse's mouth, if you will, like, what does he have to say about the liberal arts? And I will be honest, of all the readings that we've done thus far, this one was a little more challenging for me to get into and really feel, when you get into a book or any piece of writing, you just feel drawn up into it and you're in sync and you kind of lose yourself in the words. It took the longest out of any of the readings that we have had thus far to get to that place with it. I had to read it at least twice before I felt that connection with it. So I think I heard from the other group we were that met on Tuesday, there was a few other people that were sharing that same sentiment. And so, so that's a little bit about him. Really teacher, theologian, it was very important to him, the connection between the liberal learning or liberal arts and how that applies in a Christian context. And that was very important to him as well. So yeah, that's a little bit. And then of course, if people want to read more about him, it's in the book. And then I did include a couple good links that I found in the original notification email last week. But yeah, that's a little bit about him. Do you have anything that you know about him or you want to add?
Well, I just taught not this selection, but the selection that do you know the book Renewing the Mind? It's a similar type of collection. It was edited by Ryan Topping. And he has a selection from chapter 3. I'm teaching a course on the history, philosophy, and mission of the Catholic school for the Institute for Catholic School Leadership at the St. Paul Seminary. And we just covered. It's only. Actually, it's fairly long. It's just slight excerpts from chapters 3 through 19. So, and I didn't highlight a whole lot of things, and I would tend to agree that there with your experience of Hugh, that this is a little more recondite, a little more difficult to fully enter into. And I suppose just doing it in sections is probably part of the problem there.
Right.
But what I can do is line up. I see that Gamble's chapter 3 selection is exactly where Ryan Topping starts in his selection. So,
perfect.
So I thought I hadn't read what you were focusing on recently, but I think I probably read most of it through this other.
Okay, good. Well, maybe we can even read some of that aloud and discuss it. I don't think there's any need to feel pressure to get through the whole selection. Like any amount of contemplative reading and discussing is good. I will also
Yeah.
say, I think one of the other things that makes Hugh of St. Victor a little more difficult is he's assuming a lot of background knowledge in this work. So and of course, now also another thing, the selection that's actually in Richard Gamble, it doesn't have chapter 2, which sets up a lot of ideas about what he means by philosopher. And so you just jump into him using this word a lot, and without having read chapter 2. And then he also addresses it in later chapters. I was listening to the audio version on YouTube. There's an audio version on YouTube for free. So I was just listening to the whole thing. And so I did notice that. And so between there being a ton of background knowledge that if you don't have, this is going to feel confusing. And then also some of the chapters that are left out do give some additional background knowledge for how he's using terms.
Yes, very good.
Yeah. But he really zeroes in on philosopher as lover of wisdom. And in that he's distinguishing it, he takes time to distinguish that from the sophists, which is what he was saying, that philosophers used to be called sophists. And then he was showing how it was just sophist, Sophia, versus philosopher, love of wisdom. And he spent quite a bit of time showing that distinction, and seemed very important to him in like how he approaches all of this.
Right.
Okay, so should we read chapter 3 and just
that sounds good.
Okay, do you want to take turns, or do you want me to read?
Either, whatever you prefer.
It doesn't matter to me. I don't mind reading. Okay,
go ahead.
All right. Out of all the sciences above named, however, the ancients in their studies especially selected 7 to be mastered by those who were to be educated. These 7 they considered so to excel all the rest in usefulness that anyone who had been thoroughly schooled in them might afterward come to a knowledge of the others by his own inquiry and effort, rather than by listening to a teacher. For these, one might say, constitute the best instruments, the best rudiments, by which the way is prepared for the mind's complete knowledge of philosophic truth. Therefore, they are called by the name trivium and quadrivium, because by them, as by certain ways, a quick mind enters into the secret places of wisdom. In those days, no one was thought worthy the name of master who was unable to claim knowledge of these 7. Pythagoras, too, is said to have maintained the following practice as a teacher for 7 years, according to the number of the 7 liberal arts. No one of his pupils dared ask the reason behind statements made by him. Instead, he was to give credence to the words of the master until he had heard him out. And then, having done this, he would be able to come at the reason of those things himself. We read that some men studied these 7 with such zeal that they had them completely in memory, so that whatever writings they subsequently took in hand, or whatever questions they proposed for solution or proof, they did not thumb the pages of books to hunt for rules and reasons, which the liberal arts might afford for the resolution of a doubtful matter, but at once had the particulars ready by heart. Hence, it is a fact that in that time there were so many learned men that they alone wrote more than we are able to read. But the students of our day, whether from ignorance or from unwillingness, fail to hold to a fit method of study, and therefore we find many who study but few who are wise. Yet it seems to me that the student should take no less care not to expand his effort in useless studies than he should to avoid a lukewarm pursuit of good and useful ones. It is bad to pursue something good negligently. It is worse to expend many labors on an empty thing. But because not everyone is mature enough to know what is of advantage to him, I shall briefly indicate to the student which writings seem to me more useful than others, and then I shall add a few words on the method of study. I'll pause there. So that's chapter 3. Another thing for those listening, if you haven't actually looked, his chapters are basically paragraphs. So they're very short chapters.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So what stood out to you from that section?
Well, as I was teaching this, I had to laugh at the idea that a teacher would forbear questions for 7 years and make a student make the student so docile. Well, this is actually what he's setting this up for his later discussions of docility,
Mm.
and it's not that the teacher should demand this, but that a student's orientation to the truth and in seeking something um, uh, not negligently, but with earnestness and zeal. So zeal is related to student. Zealous is the lover of it's
Mhm.
zealous is almost a synonym for philosopher. A
Ah.
zealous student is in love with the truth.
Mm.
So zeal and docility go hand in hand, that you're open to it and you are oriented to it. Um,
Yeah.
so that's so I wouldn't shut students down for 7 years, but I would listen for 7 years and
Yeah.
try to learn.
I know. I thought that was funny too. I mean, practically in the classroom, like for me, that looks like usually when we're starting a new book, I do talk to my students about the idea that they have to earn the right to give their opinion, that you have to sit at the foot of the author long enough that you've heard him. And you can say, at some level, I understand what you're saying before you can just start spitting out what you think about it or whether you agree or disagree.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that. I mean, I agree it's kind of an extreme version of that. That's a long time not to say anything. But
Yeah.
one of the things I noticed in students is that they will, and I notice it in myself as well when I'm learning a new thing, is I'll want to jump to conclusions and I'll be listening to somebody speak and I'm like, yeah, but then if I like shut my mouth and slow down and listen a while longer, I will see whatever I'm worried about come for full circle. And by being present for the thing coming for full circle, I then feel the fullness of it. And not only are my questions answered in an intellectual way, but to your point about that their relationship to the truth or the text, what you were saying about that's formed in seeing it actually embodied. But if I'm interrupting all the time for my own point of view, with my own point of view, I'm not surrendering to allowing that to be formed in me.
Yeah, excellent point. It's just that is exactly uh, for Hugh, docility is the bedrock of of the path of the way. You can't actually take the via, whether it's trivium or quadrivium, without the docility to follow the path and
Mm,
be led along the path.
I
So
really love that.
I think that's that. I don't think there's anything more central to his approach than and its docility across. You know, C.S. Lewis's thing about the what is it, the hubris in relation to the past. You know that we're.
Yeah.
I'm not getting the I'm not getting the term exactly right here, but where Lewis says we could read books from the future if we had them,
Mhm.
but we don't. So we have to read books from the past because they reorient us to something that we're not in the middle of our own opinion and our own. Just I was trying to connect this to what you were saying about
Yeah.
your own.
Yeah.
If you don't quiet the conventional
Mhm.
eagerness to respond and to judge the thing that you're
Mhm.
studying, and instead, if you do take that patient, quiet, docile approach to giving the author the time and respect and love that the author deserves.
Mhm.
Since we're not reading things that are trivial, we're reading or useless. We're reading things that really matter. We have to have that right orientation to them so that
Right.
we become rightly formed in relation to them. That
Amen.
active voice that you were talking about actually is a barrier to our own formation.
It really is. And I don't think we think that it is. Because I mean, especially, and I guess it depends on the personality too, but I know for me, I'm an extrovert. I verbally process everything. And so it's taken me many years to develop the discipline to quiet that voice. And I used to tell myself the story that it was a kind of self-betrayal to like subdue that
Mm-hmm.
voice. And I
Yeah,
see it
yeah,
totally different now.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. And
That
so,
that's the
mhm,
cultural narrative, right?
yeah.
You're
Mhm.
not being you're not being true to yourself if you allow that voice to where you truly empathize with it
Mhm.
and take the point of view uh,
Yeah.
of the author as charitably as possible.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Well, and I'm curious what you think about this. So, being that this is the cultural narrative right now, I don't actually think it's good for us to betray ourselves. But I also don't think that subduing that voice is betraying myself. I wouldn't call it that anymore. Like,
Yeah.
how would you name what it actually is and what we're actually doing, and how is it not betraying ourselves? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I start with epistemology that
Mhm.
that not knowing is an isomorphism with the known, and you can't create that identity without allowing it to tell you what it is. You can't.
Mm.
It's not.
Mhm.
Exegesis. It's not eisegesis.
Mhm.
Eisegesis is projecting yourself into every text, and that's the cultural Marxist.
Right.
That's
Right.
that's the reader. That's the bad reader who
Well, and it's
thinks,
the air we breathe too. Like
yeah,
we all
yeah,
do it because we breathe that air. So it actually,
yeah,
we have to be intentional about training it out of ourselves.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
But if you clear clear the deck, so to speak, of your own ego,
Yeah.
it's clearing out the ego.
Mm.
And we to be true to yourself, you actually do have to subdue your ego, because
Right.
your ego isn't leading you. Uh,
Right.
your ego isn't leading you to flourish. Your
Right.
ego is leading you to keep the self-centered
Mhm.
attachment to things from pride and uh,
Mhm.
and envy and all the deadly things. So to be true to yourself, it's the Christian story. You have to sacrifice yourself as you know yourself, and
Mhm.
and then be given. I mean, think of being having the mind of Christ in you.
Mhm.
That's how could you be any more true to yourself than to have the mind of your maker in you? But you
Mhm.
can't get there by grasping it. You have to get there by
Right.
receiving the gift.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying because it also reminds me just of the fact that my ego isn't my true self. The
Yeah,
ego is a
yeah.
false self. And I mean, I'm Orthodox. I know you're Catholic. In the Orthodox, so in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, I see this. One of my favorite books is by Henry Nouwen, and he wrote. It's called
Mm-hmm.
"Reaching Out: The Three Movements of the Spiritual Life." And he says the first
Okay.
movement is a movement from loneliness to solitude. And what he's
Mm-hmm.
talking about in that first chapter is exactly that you're actually coming to learn how to sit with your he does. I don't remember if he uses the word ego, but that's what he's describing, the false
Mm-hmm.
self, to come to terms with it and allow it to pass away. And
Mm-hmm.
in doing that, you actually create space for other people, which the next
Yeah.
movement then is from hostility to hospitality. But as long as
Mm-hmm.
our ego and our false narratives about ourselves are so loud, we actually don't have space in ourselves, in our hearts, for anyone else, for God, for
Yeah.
the mind of Christ, for our students, for our spouse, for whoever. And so yes, I love what you're saying. And I think that's such a great answer to be like, yeah, you're not actually betraying yourself. In fact, you'd be betraying yourself if you held to your ego as though that is your true self, because that's actually not your true self. It's a movement into non-being in a way.
Yeah, and I forget whose image it is, but the empty cup is the one that can be filled with the nourishing liquid.
Mhm.
The cup we fill ourselves is keeping that from happening.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that's so good. I love that. Let's see. Well, of course, in chapter 3, he mentions the trivium and the quadrivium. And I think that's really important for the next chapter, because there's going to be, especially for those listening, if they haven't read the other chapters or don't have the background knowledge, he starts really quickly to throw out new terms. And so I think keeping in mind that when we read the next chapter in a second, that trivium and quadrivium is what he's meaning by the arts. And so he establishes that in this chapter, and then he builds on that in the next chapter. Which he says well, I'll wait till we get to chapter 4, but the way he starts talking about it, the arts versus the content in chapter 4, at first I was a little irritated, and I'm like, why are you saying it that way? But we'll get to it in a second.
Yep.
Was there anything else from chapter 3 that you wanted to bring up or mention?
No, that's great. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And he's definitely forthright about the fact that this is the way that you educate the mind for someone to become a philosopher. Oh, I wanted to point that out as well. Is just like when we're always taught, especially in Paideia circles, we obsess about milestones and coaching skills. And this is, I mean, you're seeing this in this writing as well, is the milestones to become a philosopher are the liberal arts. So like, while these, for those who do participate in Paideia teacher coaching, we look at grammar and look at the milestones within grammar. And it's like, okay, here's in first grade what grammar looks like, and on through high school, and same with logic and rhetoric. Like, this is the spectrum of milestones. And you have that for each liberal art individually. But the philosopher, the milestones that you pass through in order to think like a philosopher, to be a philosopher, are the liberal arts. They're all these different nuances of modes of inquiry that lead you to be able to handle knowledge in such a way like a philosopher does. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, is sometimes I know I do this, I want to put philosophy in its own category and then be like, I'm going to take, you could take a philosophy class and teach these milestones about how to be a philosopher. And I guess in a way you could, but if we're going to be in the tradition that we say we're in, it's the 7 liberal arts that are those skill-based milestones that lead to philosophical thinking. So that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, the perfection of the arts is the perfection of the person. They're perfected in our souls, and one of the things, I just bring it up because I've been thinking about it, not because this your comment or the text suggests it exactly, is that we have to remember that when we talk about elementary and secondary paths through grammar, logic, or dialectic and rhetoric, these are all preparatory. I mean, we're nowhere near the perfection of the arts. And unfortunately, in some schools, kids come out of, and some parents think that they're done with the path, the way. And the way is so much longer than a K through 12 classical school, or any school.
Right.
And so philosophy, while you're exactly right that it's not separate, it's that it's the architectonic unifying skill or capacity,
Mhm.
which is wisdom versus knowledge. That's the
Mm.
so that's so we do have to remember that this path is as Aquinas said, if you had enough time, uh, some people could get there, but most people are not going to get there because they'll be their minds will lead them into corners and alleys, and they'll be admixed with error on the natural level.
Mhm.
But when you add the supernatural level, then the integration of the supernatural and the natural with philosophy as the handmaiden and theology as the queen, then it can all work together in a. You're
Mm.
still not going to get many Aquinas or Aristotles,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
you're in a better position. But my whole point with that is just that this is a lifelong
Right.
path, and we're nowhere near the end. So
That's such a great thought. And it actually makes me see that hierarchy in a different way. Like if we imagine the hierarchy of learning, you have piety and gymnastic at the very bottom, that's bodily self-control and that
yeah,
heart of piety. And then you have the liberal arts, and then you have philosophy, but you start with natural philosophy, then ethics and politics, and then philosophy proper, and then theology. And now I'm seeing even theology in a different way, that the liberal arts allow me to become a philosopher, and in studying philosophy, it allows me to become a theologian with the combination of grace. Like
yeah,
with, you can't actually, just like I can't experience the fruit of being a philosopher without doing the price of admission for being a philosopher is the liberal arts. The price of admission for real theology is not just intellectual study, but a spiritual thing happening in the mind or soul of a person that's beyond just like, I'm going to hit the books and study hard.
yeah. No, it's a ladder with two directions. Uh, grace informs as
Mm-hmm.
we respond and work towards the perfection of our souls, in cooperation with it.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, do you have time to read the chapter 4 and talk about that for a few minutes before we end?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in here, and I'm happy to read it. Is that, or do you want to read?
Yeah,
I
go
don't.
ahead.
Okay, yeah, I really don't
Thank
mind.
you.
Okay. All right. Chapter 4, concerning the two kinds of writings. Okay. There are two kinds of writings. The first kind comprises what are properly called the arts. The second, those writings which are appendages of the arts. The arts are included in philosophy. They have, that is, some definite and established part of philosophy for their subject matter, as do grammar, dialectic, and others of this sort. The appendages of the appendages of the arts, however, are only tangential, that's how you pronounce, to philosophy. What they treat is some extra philosophical matter. Occasionally, it is true, they touch in a scattered and confused fashion upon some topics lifted out of the arts, or if their narrative presentation is simple, they prepare the way for philosophy. Of this sort are all the songs of the poets, tragedies, comedies, satires, heroic verse and lyric, iambics, certain didactic poems, fables, and histories, and also the writings of those fellows whom today we commonly call philosophers, and who are always taking some small matter and dragging it out through long verbal detours, obscuring a simple meaning in confused discourses, who, lumping even dissimilar things together, make, as it were, a single picture from a multitude of colors and forms. Keep in mind the two things I have distinguished for you, the arts and the appendages of the arts. Between these two, however, there is, in my view, such distance, as the poet describes when he says, as much as the fiery willow seeds to the pale olive, or the wild nard to the roses of Punic red. It is a distance that the man wishing to attain knowledge, yet who willingly deserts truth in order to entangle himself in these mere byproducts of the arts, will find, I shall say, not infinite, but exceedingly great pains and meager fruit. Finally, the arts themselves, without these things that border on them, are able to make the student perfect, while the latter things, without the arts, are capable of conferring no perfection. And this the more especially since the latter have nothing desirable with which to tempt the student except what they have taken over and adapted from the arts. And no one should seek in them anything but what is of the arts. For this reason, it appears to me that our efforts should first be given to the arts, and which are the foundation stones of all things, and in which pure and simple truth is revealed, and especially to the 7 already mentioned, which comprise the tools of all philosophy. Afterwards, if time affords, let these other things be read, for sometimes we are better pleased when entertaining reading is mixed with serious, and rarity makes what is good seems precious. Thus, we sometimes more eagerly take up a thought we come upon in the midst of a story. It is in the 7 liberal arts, however, that the foundation of all learning is to be found. Before all others, these ought to be had at hand, because without them, the philosophical discipline does not and cannot explain and define anything. These indeed so hang together and so depend upon one another in their ideas that if only one of the arts be lacking, all the rest cannot make a man into a philosopher. Therefore, those persons seem to me to be in error who, not appreciating the coherence among the arts, select certain of them for study, and leaving the rest untouched, think they can become perfect in these alone.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So,
But yeah, I mean, this, I feel like it brings up a tension that, I mean, he's pretty forthright on, so first of all, I want to create a little clarity. So, and tell me if you read this differently, if you see this differently. So what I'm hearing him say is make this distinction between, so he's making a distinction between 2 kinds of writing, the arts and the appendages of the arts. And how I'm reading it, another way I might say it is writings that are specifically about the 7 liberal arts. So a book about grammar, a book about logic specifically, or a book about rhetoric, and then the content that we use that we might apply the arts to and can apply the arts to and can see the arts show up in, which she does mention, but those for the sake of themselves are not as high a priority as reading the writings of about the arts themselves. And I'm reading this into the text. So he doesn't actually say this, but I'm assuming this would apply, is because their arts, their skills, I would assume that also means they're practicing these in some way and they're cultivating them in some way. Which you have a different relationship when you're reading content versus taking in content versus taking in skill. So that's how I'm seeing the distinction. Do you see it differently or in a similar way?
Similar, but maybe we can come at it from the old quarrel between the philosophers and the poets, and
Okay.
maybe shed, because I don't think it's just reading about the art, but it
Okay.
is actually doing philosophy or doing things um, that are included in philosophy, whereas and the poets can be, I think he's saying that the poets can be preparatory for that. A good poem can lead you toward the truth, but I think he's also echoing what Plato said about the poets, which is that they can, the beautiful words can distract you. They can be appendages that what does he say? Even so, he does it both for philosophers, for poets, and for quote unquote philosophers who are always taking some matter and dragging it out. They're not getting at anything. They are down a blind alley, and they're either sophists or they just don't know what they're doing. So they're either selling their loquacity and rhetoric for money, as the sophists did, or they're just lost and they think they're philosophers, but they're not really getting at the heart of things. So I think it is this problem of poetry, where poetry can go either way, just as rhetoric, just as political speech, or anything can be a hinge to the good or the bad by its use. But I think he's getting at writings that are foreshadowing and participating in philosophical wisdom or not.
Okay.
So does that cohere with what you're?
Yeah. I wondered if I mean, it makes sense that he would be piggybacking on what Plato is talking about there. So it's that makes sense. One thing that stood out, another thing that stood out to me, is when he says, where did the line go? Oh yeah. In the second full paragraph and about the middle, he says, okay, finally, the arts themselves, without these things that border on them, are capable to make the student perfect. So echoing back to the last chapter, and then also what you said about the perfection of the arts is the perfection of the person, while the latter things, the poets and these other philosophers, without the arts, are capable of conferring no perfection. So the power within each of those things, one has actual power to bring about perfection, while the other does not. And this is more especially since the latter, having nothing desirable with which to tempt the student except what they have taken over and adapted from the arts, and no one should seek in them anything but what is of the arts. And so that stood out to me, and it made me think about, so how I'm reading that, you tell me what you think, is he's saying that even when I'm reading the poets or these other philosophers, I should be applying my way of philosophizing, or my way of this mode of inquiry, or this way of thinking, when I'm reading the poets. When I'm reading whatever I'm reading, I should be practicing my ways of being that I've learned when I was studying the arts, that bring that skill set into reading these other things, that anything of value that is in them is really going to be there because they are found some kind of harmony with the arts, or are embodying it or echoing it in some way.
Yeah, I would say it has to be there. It's not so you're correct that what you're trying to do, what he's recommending, is is the true interdisciplinarity of philosophy, which is that the arts cohere and complement each other and relate to one another in a whole. And he's distinguishing the writings that are part of that and enhance it and lead you towards that philosophical or architectonic wisdom. But he's saying there are writings that just don't get you there because they are pretty pictures that aren't in any way, they just took a bunch of colors and distracted you.
Right.
And the forms are not real forms.
So you're arrive at anything by studying them, even if you were to apply these modes of inquiry. You couldn't arrive at anything anyway. That makes
exactly.
Okay.
Good. You already had what whatever you're going to get out of them, you already had. And I think that's what you were kind of trying to make the best of those writings by saying, if you take the right approach.
I'm like, we want to give some props to the poet. You spent time on that.
But I think from his point of view, he would say there are things that you just the pulp fiction, just leave it aside. It's not going to get you.
Things you can just cancel. In other words, is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Well, they're just there's you don't have to cancel them because there's nothing in them,
Oh, so
right?
it's like, how do
You
you
know,
cancel non-being?
it's yeah,
Already
it's not
non-being,
going to
it's already
be
canceled. Wow.
it's not to say that you couldn't enjoy a diversion, but when you're
Mhm.
talking about the arts and their and wisdom and the coherence of the seven arts in particular, uh, then these writings do not fit. Um,
Mm,
and they tend to, and this is the problem of sophistry in all periods, but
right.
we know it from Plato's interactions with Gorgias and others, that they are manipulators of language, not seekers of truth.
Right.
So, and it's not that they, so Gamble does make the point, I think another of his books, oh, and maybe it's not Gamble. There's a book called Philosophers versus Orators, or Philosophers and Orators. And,
Mm,
the sophists there are good, I should be more, more subtle. There are sophists that are working towards political order
mhm,
and are better because their oratory is useful to the city.
mm.
And there are sophists who are venal and are making their living not seeking the truth.
Yeah.
Um, but they are both distinct from, and Cicero is more on that side as one of the good orators. Um,
Mhm.
but apart from that, philosophy is a different thing than oratory, fundamentally.
Right.
They can both be oriented to the good, but philosophy is um, its own higher perfection.
And that makes sense. My favorite class that I teach is oratory. And one of the things we talk about it, I mean, there's because it's the oratory is really the last two canons of rhetoric. You have the first three that really govern the writing process, but then the last
Mhm.
two, memory
Yeah,
and oration,
yeah,
is governing
yeah.
that oratory. And what I tell my students all the time, because ethical questions come up all the time in the study of rhetoric, and because in one sense you feel the tension towards sophistry
Yeah,
versus this other thing, the
yeah,
tension towards manipulation. You feel that. And in order to
yeah,
teach rhetoric well, I think all rhetoric teachers must acknowledge that reality, that
yeah.
I'm giving you
That's
tools where you could actually manipulate another human being.
that's
And what do we
exactly right.
do with that? That's real.
Yep,
And so
yep.
we usually talk about that openly in my rhetoric
Mhm.
classes. And we talk about connecting it with virtue. And one of the things when it comes to the oratorical part of it is, I say your job as an orator is to tell the truth with your voice and body.
Mm.
You're saying, now in my classes, they're reciting words other people have said. So the words stand for themselves. But I'm saying when you read this speech, when you recite this speech or this poem or this play, have you discovered the nature of this speech? And are you telling the truth with how you
Mhm.
say it? Or are you giving it a slight of meaning that wasn't intended
Yeah,
because of how you use your voice or body? So it's also still,
mhm.
how do we tell the truth?
Yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
in another way.
Awesome, awesome,
Yeah.
awesome.
But that's so
Yeah,
different than
and
actually doing the discovery of it, which is what the
yeah,
philosopher is going to be doing.
yeah,
Like the
yeah. And
oratory is embodying it in a different way.
exactly. And I remember that's Bruce Kimball, not Gamble. Bruce
Okay.
Kimball, Philosophers and Orators, and it's essentially you're, as you laid it out. That's exactly right. There is the best. So this would be perfect for Hugh's treatment. Good oratory is in the art of rhetoric. Uh,
Mhm.
Bad oratory moves itself out into demagoguery,
Mhm.
sophistry, etc. So,
Yeah. Oh, that's so good.
yeah.
I've really enjoyed discussing this with you. I hope,
Likewise, great to see
yeah,
you.
it's great to see you as well. I hope to see you at future
Yeah,
discussions.
yeah. Well, I just keep sending the links, and we'll try to be there. And
Indeed, I will.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I will talk to you soon.
Very
Bye.
good. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.